My name is Sonia. I am 18 years old, and on the coldest morning of November, I sat on my front porch and watched my parents arrive with a corporate developer to sell my entire inheritance out from under me. It was exactly 7:55. The Maine air bit at my cheeks, carrying that sharp mix of crushed pine needles, low tide, and freezing salt spray off the Atlantic. I sat on the top step of the cedar wraparound porch at Blackwood Cove. The wood beneath me was weathered silver, beaten by decades of storms, but unyielding. I had my arms wrapped tight in my grandfather's battered canvas coat. The frayed sleeves smelled faintly of diesel fuel and old rope. It was the only armor I needed. Down the long dirt driveway, the heavy crunch of tires broke the morning quiet. Two black SUVs polished to a mirror shine rolled through the iron gates. They looked absurd against the backdrop of raw timber and jagged coastline. My father Garrett stepped out first. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, adjusting his silk tie before his Italian leather shoes even touched the dirt. My mother Valerie followed. Her camel-colored trench coat was cinched tight, her posture rigid, her expression fixed. They projected the image of a successful, untroubled couple executing a routine transaction. From the second vehicle emerged Preston, a Boston developer known for turning working-class harbors into sterile resorts. He scanned the 50 acres of shoreline and our family's deep-water commercial docks with hungry eyes. Garrett marched up the wooden steps, not even bothering to meet my gaze. He treated me with the familiar dismissive wave of a hand he reserved for the harbor hands. "Sonia, go inside," he ordered. His voice carried that practiced, authoritative cadence. "We are signing the sale papers. The adults need the table." He held up a leather-bound clipboard. Inside rested a document designed to liquidate everything my grandparents built. He believed his signature would erase the fleet the docks and my future, trading it all for a wire transfer to cover his hidden debts. Before I tell you how I wiped that smug look right off my father's face, tell me how old you are in the comments. And welcome back to Amanda Told Stories. I did not move. I did not flinch. I just wrapped my fingers tighter around my ceramic coffee mug, feeling the warmth seep into my palms. For a split second, Preston met my eyes, offering a thin, triumphant smirk. He thought he just bought a kingdom for pennies. What they did not know was that the trap had already snapped shut. The ink on the real estate contract was worthless. They were strutting across land they no longer controlled. To understand how I cornered my own blood on this frosty coastal morning, we have to rewind the clock. We must go back exactly 24 hours to the most expensive theatrical and deeply orchestrated celebration ever hosted in Portland. They thought they were playing a naive teenager, but I had already rewritten the rules. To understand the depth of their betrayal, you need to know the architects of Blackwood Cove. My grandfather Elias built this commercial fishing empire from a single wooden skiff and a rusted lobster trap. He was a man carved directly from the rocky coast itself. His hands felt like coarse grit sandpaper, calloused from decades of hauling frozen ropes out of the unforgiving Atlantic. He woke up long before the sun, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floorboards, smelling faintly of bait and strong black coffee. My grandmother Ruth was just as formidable. She managed the distribution ledgers at a scarred oak desk overlooking the harbor, a yellow pencil tucked behind her ear, tracking every penny with ruthless precision. They were the boulders of my life. They were steady, unyielding, and fiercely protective of the legacy they built from nothing. My father Garrett was merely a pebble. He grew up surrounded by the raw, unvarnished grit of the docks, but he despised every inch of it. He craved the prestige of wealth without possessing the backbreaking work ethic required to sustain it. He hated the smell of the harbor. He practically bathed in expensive cologne to mask the scent of the ocean whenever he was forced to visit the distribution warehouse. He wanted to be seen as Maine high society. He spent his afternoons at the Portland Country Club, networking with men in pastel polo shirts who traded corporate futures they could not physically lift. He looked down on the fishermen who actually brought in the catch, ignoring the fact that their daily sweat funded his tailored suits and his expensive golf clubs. When my grandparents passed away during a brutal winter storm 4 years ago, they left behind a will that was a masterpiece of legal foresight. They knew exactly who their son was. The reading of the will took place in a sterile downtown office far away from the salt air. Nolan, their longtime estate attorney, sat across a polished mahogany table and read the document in a calm, flat tone. The estate entirely bypassed Garrett and Valerie. The deep-water docks, the 50 acres of pine forest, the commercial distribution fleet, and the bank accounts were placed into a protective minor trust. I was the sole beneficiary. The assets would transfer directly to my control the second I turned 18. Until that clock struck midnight, Garrett and Valerie were appointed as legal caretakers. They were given a modest stipend to manage the daily operations, but they owned nothing. I will never forget the look on my father's face in that office. The thick blue vein in his forehead pulsed rapidly. His jaw clamped tight. Valerie gripped her designer leather purse until her knuckles turned white, her painted fingernails digging into the seams. They were humiliated. They were reduced to middle management by their own parents. From that day forward, they waged a quiet, psychological war against me. They spent 4 years conditioning me to believe the estate was a toxic burden. Valerie would sit at the kitchen island, staring at the company ledger with a manufactured sigh rubbing her temples. She would call the commercial docks a financial black hole. She claimed the maintenance costs were draining our family dry. Garrett would pace the living room, complaining about the liability of the fleet and the unpredictable nature of the fishing industry. He told me that owning property was a trap. He painted a picture of a future where I would be chained to a dying harbor, drowning in debt and endless repairs. They wanted me to view my inheritance as a curse. They assumed that if they complained enough, I would beg them to sell the property the moment I became a legal adult, freeing myself from the stress they had carefully fabricated. I played my part perfectly. I nodded along with their complaints. I kept my expression blank and offered sympathetic sighs. I acted like a teenager who cared more about passing biology class than managing a multi-million-dollar commercial enterprise. But they had no idea what I was doing after the school bell rang.
I asked the agent how much a tiny sliver of the commercial dock would fetch on the open market. I told her I did not care about the fishing boats. I explicitly stated that I just wanted enough fast cash to buy a brand new luxury sports car the second I turned 18. I complained about the smell of the harbor. I put on an award-winning performance of a spoiled teenager ready to trade a priceless family legacy for a shiny set of keys. I stopped talking and listened closely to the hallway.
My grandfather had left his battered canvas jacket hanging on an iron peg by the back door of the main house. Valerie tried to throw it in the trash twice, calling it a filthy eyesore. I rescued it both times. I started wearing it every single day. The fabric was stiff, smelling of engine grease and salt air. My parents mocked me for it, telling me I looked like a dockhand instead of a young lady. They did not understand that the jacket was my armor. It grounded me. It reminded me of the boulders who built the ground beneath my feet, giving me the strength to endure the pebbles trying to chip away at my foundation. To execute my ultimate plan, I needed Garrett and Valerie to remain arrogant. I needed them to believe I was exactly what they raised my younger sister Harper to be: shallow, naive, and easily bought. A cornered animal is dangerous, but a complacent enemy makes mistakes. 4 days before my 18th birthday, I set a trap right in our living room. I sat on the velvet sofa holding my phone. I knew my father was in his home office just down the hall, and I knew the heavy oak door was cracked open. I dialed the number of a local real estate agent. When she answered, I made sure my voice was loud, whiny, and dripping with adolescent impatience.
To understand the depth of their betrayal, you need to know the architects of Blackwood Cove. My grandfather Elias built this commercial fishing empire from a single wooden skiff and a rusted lobster trap. He was a man carved directly from the rocky coast itself. His hands felt like coarse grit sandpaper, calloused from decades of hauling frozen ropes out of the unforgiving Atlantic. He woke up long before the sun, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floorboards, smelling faintly of bait and strong black coffee. My grandmother Ruth was just as formidable. She managed the distribution ledgers at a scarred oak desk overlooking the harbor, a yellow pencil tucked behind her ear, tracking every penny with ruthless precision. They were the boulders of my life. They were steady, unyielding, and fiercely protective of the legacy they built from nothing.
I stopped talking and listened closely to the hallway.
When my grandparents passed away during a brutal winter storm 4 years ago, they left behind a will that was a masterpiece of legal foresight. They knew exactly who their son was. The reading of the will took place in a sterile downtown office, far away from the salt air. Nolan, their longtime estate attorney, sat across a polished mahogany table and read the document in a calm, flat tone. The estate entirely bypassed Garrett and Valerie. The deep water docks, the 50 acres of pine forest, the commercial distribution fleet, and the bank accounts were placed into a protective minor trust. I was the sole beneficiary. The assets would transfer directly to my control the second I turned 18. Until that clock struck midnight, Garrett and Valerie were appointed as legal caretakers. They were given a modest stipend to manage the daily operations, but they owned nothing. I will never forget the look on my father's face in that office. The thick, blue vein in his forehead pulsed rapidly. His jaw clamped tight. Valerie gripped her designer leather purse until her knuckles turned white, her painted fingernails digging into the seams. They were humiliated. They were reduced to middle management by their own parents. From that day forward, they waged a quiet psychological war against me. They spent 4 years conditioning me to believe the estate was a toxic burden. Valerie would sit at the kitchen island staring at the company ledger with a manufactured sigh rubbing her temples. She would call the commercial docks a financial black hole. She claimed the maintenance costs were draining our family dry. Garrett would pace the living room, complaining about the liability of the fleet and the unpredictable nature of the fishing industry. He told me that owning property was a trap. He painted a picture of a future where I would be chained to a dying harbor, drowning in debt and endless repairs. They wanted me to view my inheritance as a curse. They assumed that if they complained enough, I would beg them to sell the property the moment I became a legal adult, freeing myself from the stress they had carefully fabricated. I played my part perfectly. I nodded along with their complaints. I kept my expression blank and offered sympathetic sighs. I acted like a teenager who cared more about passing biology class than managing a multi-million-dollar commercial enterprise. But they had no idea what I was doing after the school bell rang. Instead of going to the mall with my classmates, I rode my bicycle straight to the harbor master's office. Behind the dusty stacks of tide charts and vessel maintenance logs, I kept a hidden stack of heavy textbooks. While my parents thought I was scrolling through social media, I was reading Maine probate law. I studied corporate trust structures until the dense legal text blurred in front of my eyes. I learned the distinct legal differences between revocable and irrevocable trusts. I researched how a caretaker could be audited for financial mismanagement. I mapped out the exact steps required to transfer commercial deeds without tipping off the executors. I absorbed the knowledge quietly, building a legal arsenal in the shadows of the very docks my parents despised. My grandfather had left his battered canvas jacket hanging on an iron peg by the back door of the main house. Valerie tried to throw it in the trash twice, calling it a filthy eyesore. I rescued it both times. I started wearing it every single day. The fabric was stiff, smelling of engine grease and salt air. My parents mocked me for it, telling me I looked like a dockhand instead of a young lady. They did not understand that the jacket was my armor. It grounded me. It reminded me of the boulders who built the ground beneath my feet, giving me the strength to endure the pebbles trying to chip away at my foundation. To execute my ultimate plan, I needed Garrett and Valerie to remain arrogant. I needed them to believe I was exactly what they raised my younger sister Harper to be: shallow, naive, and easily bought. A cornered animal is dangerous, but a complacent enemy makes mistakes. 4 days before my 18th birthday, I set a trap right in our living room. I sat on the velvet sofa holding my phone. I knew my father was in his home office just down the hall, and I knew the heavy oak door was cracked open. I dialed the number of a local real estate agent. When she answered, I made sure my voice was loud, whiny, and dripping with adolescent impatience. I asked the agent how much a tiny sliver of the commercial dock would fetch on the open market. I told her I did not care about the fishing boats. I explicitly stated that I just wanted enough fast cash to buy a brand new luxury sports car the second I turned 18. I complained about the smell of the harbor. I put on an award-winning performance of a spoiled teenager ready to trade a priceless family legacy for a shiny set of keys. I stopped talking and listened closely to the hallway. From the shadows of the home office, I heard my father exhale a long, heavy breath. A moment later, I heard the faint clinking of ice cubes hitting a glass. He was pouring himself a drink to celebrate. The tension radiating from his office vanished instantly. He thought he had me figured out. He believed I was just a greedy girl who would eagerly sign away the entire 50 acres to fund a shopping spree. My parents overheard that fake phone call and relaxed. They thought my ignorance guaranteed their success. They truly believed they could orchestrate a sweeping real estate buyout with a corporate developer without me ever reading the fine print. They had no idea I already knew how to legally block a deed transfer. They were so busy treating me like a foolish child that they failed to notice the sharp edges I had developed. They were about to learn a very hard lesson. In Maine, you either learn to navigate the hidden rocky waters, or you sink without a trace. And the current pulling them under was already moving faster than they could possibly swim. The atmosphere inside the glass-walled pavilion of the Portland Yacht Club was suffocating. By 11:30 that evening, the air had grown thick with the overwhelming scent of expensive perfume, wilted floral centerpieces, and the sour tang of spilled champagne. The room was packed with people who did not know my middle name, let alone my ambitions. They were Garrett and Valerie's wealthy friends, invited purely to serve as an audience for my parents' carefully orchestrated charade. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, watching my father tap a silver spoon against his crystal flute. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the jazz music playing in the background. The room quieted. Garrett took the microphone, adjusting his tailored suit jacket with a practiced, sweeping motion. He looked out at the crowd, plastering on a warm, deeply emotional expression that made my stomach turn. He launched into a tearful, entirely fake speech about my bright future. He spoke eloquently about the heavy responsibilities of adulthood and how incredibly proud he was of the young woman I had become. He even managed to force a solitary tear to well up in the corner of his eye, dabbing it away with a silk handkerchief. The crowd murmured in sympathy, captivated by the performance of a loving, devoted father. I watched his other hand. The hand not holding the handkerchief was buried deep in his trouser pocket, and his thumb was frantically rubbing the fabric. His eyes kept darting past the crowd, landing squarely on the large analog clock hanging above the bar. He was counting the minutes until midnight. He was counting the seconds until my protective minor trust technically expired, leaving Blackwood Cove vulnerable to the forged extension of guardianship resting inside his leather briefcase. He thought he was delivering a loving tribute to a daughter he had successfully outsmarted. I offered a polite, practiced smile to the guests turning to look at me. I nodded in all the right places. I let Harper step into the spotlight, watching my sister twirl her designer silk dress for the photographer desperately trying to steal the attention back to herself. My mother stood beside her, beaming with pride, her eyes equally glued to the clock. They were so consumed by their own performance that they did not notice me stepping backward. I moved slowly, blending into the shadows of the tall potted palms lining the perimeter. I timed my exit perfectly, with a loud round of applause. I pushed open the heavy glass doors at the rear of the pavilion and slipped out into the night. The contrast was immediate and bracing. The coastal Maine air was freezing, biting through my thin evening dress. The sharp scent of salt, decaying kelp, and dense pine needles rushed into my lungs, clearing away the suffocating stench of the party. The darkness of the marina parking lot felt like a welcoming embrace. I walked swiftly across the crushed oyster shells lining the path, my heels making a soft, crunching sound. At the far end of the lot, parked away from the luxury sedans and imported sports cars, a heavy-duty pickup truck sat idling. The headlights were off, but the faint orange glow of a dashboard light illuminated the silhouette inside. I opened the passenger door and climbed into the heated cabin. Nolan, my grandparents' notoriously ruthless estate attorney, sat behind the wheel. He wore a heavy wool coat, his hands resting easily on the steering wheel. He did not offer a warm greeting or ask how the party was going. He simply put the truck into gear and drove out of the lot. We drove toward downtown Portland in total silence. The city streets were mostly empty, the streetlights casting long, rhythmic shadows across the dashboard. I looked out the window, watching the familiar brick buildings and dark storefronts blur past. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about how much he trusted the man sitting next to me. Nolan was not a country club lawyer. He was a bulldog who had spent decades defending the commercial docks from corporate raiders and greedy politicians. Now he was defending those docks from the founder's own son. We pulled into the alley behind his historic brick office building. We rode the creaking service elevator up to the 4th floor. Nolan unlocked the heavy oak door to his suite and flicked on a single brass desk lamp. The room smelled of old paper leather bindings and faint cigar smoke. I sat down in the high-backed leather chair opposite his desk. On the wall behind him, a heavy antique clock ticked away the final moments of my childhood. It was 11:55. Nolan opened a thick, fireproof safe behind his desk and extracted a heavy, watermarked folder. He set it down on the mahogany surface and opened it, revealing dozens of pages of dense legal text. He placed a heavy gold fountain pen next to the stack. We waited. The ticking of the clock echoed in the quiet room. My heart hammered against my ribs, matching the relentless rhythm. I watched the minute hand slowly inch its way to the top of the dial. At exactly 12:01 in the morning, the heavy chimes of the clock began to ring. My 18th birthday had officially begun. I was a legal adult. Nolan looked at me, his sharp eyes reflecting the low light of the lamp. "Once you sign this, Sonia," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, "Blackwood Cove transfers immediately into an irrevocable private trust. You are the sole trustee. Your grandparents anticipated that your father might try to fabricate documents to retain control. By creating this new trust, the exact second you turn 18, any forged extensions of guardianship he plans to file in the morning are instantly nullified. The assets move before his paperwork even reaches a judge." I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. I did not hesitate. I did not let my hand tremble. I pressed the nib to the thick parchment and signed my name. I signed the first page, feeling the weight of the last 4 years begin to fracture. I signed the second page, severing the financial leverage my mother used to control my every move. I signed 12 times in total. With every stroke of the pen, I was building a towering legal fortress against my own blood. I was raising the drawbridge. I was taking command of the empire my grandfather built. Nolan took the documents, inspecting each signature with meticulous care. He stamped the pages with his heavy notary seal, the loud thud echoing like a gavel striking a block. "It is done," he said softly, sliding the folder back into his safe. "You are the sovereign owner of the Blackwood Cove estate and the entire commercial distribution fleet." I leaned back in the leather chair, letting out a long, ragged breath. The tension that had lived in my shoulders for 4 years finally drained away. I looked across the desk at the man who had helped me secure my future. "They have a closing scheduled with Preston at 8 o'clock this morning," I told Nolan. My father plans to hand over the deeds right on our front porch. Nolan paused, resting his hands on the polished wood. A slow, sharp smile spread across his weathered face. It was a clinical, predatory expression. "Let them show up," he replied. Nolan drove me back to the edge of the Blackwood Cove property an hour later. The estate was shrouded in the thick early morning coastal fog. I walked up the long dirt driveway alone, listening to the distant crash of the waves against the cliffs. Back in Portland, the yacht club party was likely winding down. My parents were probably toasting each other in the back of their hired town car, celebrating their impending wealth. They believed they had successfully navigated the legal loopholes, securing their financial freedom, while leaving me with nothing but a fake smile and an empty bank account. The dramatic irony was delicious. They were raising their glasses to a victory they had already lost. They were counting money that belonged to a phantom. They thought the morning sun would bring them salvation, completely unaware that they were walking straight into an ambush. I walked up the steps of the dark cedar porch, sat down in the freezing cold, and waited for the sun to rise. The timeline snaps back like a taut mooring line breaking under massive pressure. It is exactly 8 in the morning. The coastal fog is finally beginning to burn off, revealing the jagged gray rocks of the harbor below. I am still sitting on the top step of the cedar porch, my hands wrapped tightly around my cooling coffee mug. Garrett clears his throat. The sound is sharp, impatient, designed to snap me out of whatever daydream he assumes I am having. He taps the face of his expensive silver wristwatch with his index finger. The polished metal catches the pale morning light, casting a harsh reflection across the wooden planks. "We are on a tight schedule, Sonia," he dictates. His tone is clipped, laced with that familiar, patronizing edge he always uses when addressing me. He holds out the thick leather clipboard containing the forged real estate contract. "We are your legal guardians. We have already handled all the complicated details. We just need to finalize this inside where it is warm. The adults have business to conclude." Behind him, Valerie pulls her camel trench coat tighter against the biting ocean wind. She flashes a perfectly engineered smile toward the developer. "I will have the housekeeper put on a fresh pot of coffee," she offers, her voice dripping with artificial hospitality. "We can sign the closing documents in the dining room overlooking the water. It provides a marvelous view of the parcel." Preston nods, entirely satisfied with the illusion my parents have constructed. He gestures to the man standing slightly behind him. The developer's attorney is a towering figure in a navy pinstripe suit holding a sleek carbon fiber briefcase. The lawyer sets his briefcase on the wooden railing of my porch, snapping the latches open with a pair of sharp clicks. He extracts a gold fountain pen, unscrewing the cap with practiced efficiency. He does not even look at me. To him, I am just part of the scenery, a minor obstacle to be stepped around. Harper groans loudly from the driveway. She is leaning against the fender of my father's vehicle, scrolling furiously on her phone. "Can we please hurry this up?" she whines, not bothering to look up from her bright screen. The dealership said my new car is fully detailed and ready for pickup by 10. I am freezing out here. Every single one of them is operating under the absolute certainty that this transaction is a done deal. They are counting the cash. They are visualizing the bulldozers tearing down my childhood home. They are already spending the money they intend to steal from my grandfather's legacy. I do not yell. I do not cry. I do not throw a tantrum like the spoiled child my father desperately wants me to be. Panic is a luxury I discarded years ago. I slowly set my ceramic mug down on the weathered wooden boards. The soft thud anchors me to the present moment. I stand up, smoothing the front of my canvas jacket. The rough fabric feels like armor against my palms. I bypass my father entirely. I completely ignore his outstretched clipboard. I walk straight toward Preston's attorney. I reach deep into the inside pocket of the heavy coat and pull out the certified time-stamped folder I secured just 8 hours ago. The thick parchment feels substantial, heavy with the weight of undisputed truth. I extend my arm and press the manila envelope directly into the center of the attorney's chest, forcing him to take it. As of 12:01 this morning, Blackwood Cove was legally transferred into the Hamilton Legacy Trust, I state. My voice does not shake. It rings out clear and steady, cutting through the sound of the crashing surf. My parents' caretaker status expired the very second I turned 18. They have zero legal authority to sell, leverage, or alter this estate. Garrett lets out a harsh, mocking laugh. It sounds hollow, bouncing awkwardly off the towering pine trees. "Do not listen to her," he says, waving his hand dismissively. "She is just a sentimental teenager throwing a fit over some old fishing boats. We have the approved extension of guardianship right here. We are fully authorized to close this deal." But the attorney is not listening to Garrett. He is a professional, paid to mitigate risk, and the document in his hands represents a massive, glaring liability. He pulls the heavy pages from the folder. His eyes dart rapidly across the dense legal text. He runs his thumb over the raised notary seals, feeling the indented ridges of the official stamp. He checks the timestamp embedded at the very top of the page. 12:01 in the morning. The silence that descends upon the porch is absolute. It is a heavy, suffocating quiet, infinitely louder than the ocean churning against the granite cliffs below. It is the sound of an elaborate lie collapsing under the crushing weight of reality. The attorney slowly lowers the document. The bored indifference on his face has been entirely replaced by professional terror. He leans close to Preston, whispering frantically into the developer's ear. He points directly to the raised seal. He shakes his head vigorously, his movements sharp and panicked. Preston snatches the folder from his lawyer. He reads the first paragraph. The veins in his thick neck begin to bulge against his starched collar. The smug, triumphant aura he carried up my driveway evaporates, replaced by a dark, volatile fury. His face turns a deep, mottled shade of crimson. He whips his head around to glare at my father. He looks at the forged extension of guardianship still clamped in Garrett's hand. The developer realizes instantly that he has been played for a fool. "You brought me all the way up to Maine to buy a property you do not even own," Preston snarls. His voice is a low, dangerous rumble, dripping with pure venom. Garrett stammers. The confident, wealthy patriarch routine shatters into a million jagged pieces. The blood rapidly drains from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. "No, you have to understand. There is a misunderstanding," he stutters, holding his empty hands up defensively. "She is just a kid. She does not know what she is doing. The paperwork is complicated. Give us an hour to sort this out." "She is the trustee," the lawyer snaps back, his voice slicing through Garrett's pathetic excuses like a surgical scalpel. The attorney forcefully grabs the genuine documents back from his boss and shoves them into his briefcase. He does not bother organizing his files. He just wants to get off my property before the situation escalates into a criminal investigation. "Are you actively trying to commit real estate fraud?" Preston roars, stepping aggressively toward my father. "You dragged my firm into a fraudulent transaction. You forged a legal extension to sell an estate that was locked into an irrevocable trust 8 hours ago. Do you have any idea what kind of liability you just exposed me to?" Valerie gasps, taking a sudden step backward. She clutches her expensive coat, her eyes wide with genuine panic. Harper finally looks up from her phone, sensing the violent shift in the atmosphere. The promise of her luxury vehicle vanishes into thin air, replaced by a terrifying new reality. Preston does not wait for an explanation. He is an apex predator in the corporate world, and he knows exactly when the water has been poisoned. We are done here. He spits his words laced with absolute disgust. If you ever contact my firm again, I will have you indicted. The developer spins on his heel and marches down the wooden steps, moving with the heavy, destructive momentum of a runaway freight train. His attorney scrambles to keep up, snapping his carbon fiber briefcase shut as he practically runs toward the idling vehicles. Garrett reaches out his hand, grasping desperately at empty air. Preston, wait! We can renegotiate! He pleads, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. The heavy doors of the black SUVs slam shut in unison. The sound echoes like cannon fire across the quiet cove. The engines roar to life. The drivers slam the vehicles into reverse, the tires spinning violently in the dirt. They tear down the long driveway, spitting a hail of crushed gravel into the tall seagrass, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of thick dust and the bitter stench of burning rubber. I stand completely still on the top step of the porch. I watch the glowing taillights disappear through the iron gates. The morning air feels remarkably clean. The immediate threat of the corporate developer has been neutralized. The estate is secure. The deed is locked safely inside a vault downtown. But as the dust settles over the driveway, a new, much darker reality takes hold. I slowly turn around to face the people standing on my porch. The corporate shark has retreated, but the real monsters are still standing right in front of me. My father is staring at me, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles are completely white. My mother is looking at me as if I am a dangerous stranger who just broke into her home. The real estate deal is dead. The immediate battle is over. But as Garrett takes a slow, menacing step toward me, his eyes burning with a blinding rage I have never witnessed before, I realize the terrifying truth. The war with my family has just begun. The sound of the heavy tires fades into the dense pine forest. The swirling dust slowly settles over the crushed gravel of the driveway. For a long moment, the only noise left on the property is the relentless crashing of the Atlantic waves against the granite cliffs below. The silence on the porch is heavy and thick. The pristine, wealthy facade my family spent years meticulously crafting shatters right in front of me, raining invisible shards across the weathered cedar planks. My father remains frozen, staring at the empty iron gates. He holds the forged extension of guardianship loosely in his hand. The paper suddenly looks pathetic, a worthless prop from a canceled stage play. Slowly, the realization of what just happened washes over him. The corporate developer is gone. The multi-million-dollar lifeline he desperately needed has evaporated. Garrett turns to face me. The suave, confident patriarch who networked at the Portland Country Club vanishes completely. His shoulders hunch forward. His tailored charcoal suit suddenly looks ill-fitting, unable to mask the frantic posture of a cornered animal. A dark, terrifying flush creeps up his neck, mottling his skin. I know this specific brand of rage. I grew up navigating around it. It is a suffocating, deeply personal fury he kept strictly locked behind the heavy mahogany doors of our home. He never directed this venom toward his golden child, Harper. When she crashed her first car or failed her classes, she received patient sighs and expensive tutors. But whenever I failed to project the obedient, flawless image he required, I received the cold, quiet hostility now burning in his eyes. "What did you do?" he whispers. The words scrape against his throat, sharp and ragged. He takes a slow step toward me. His hands ball into tight fists at his sides. "What did you do?" he screams. The volume is deafening, raw with unhinged panic. "You just ruined this family. You just destroyed everything." He points a trembling finger directly at my chest, his chest heaving with erratic breaths. He expects me to shrink. He expects me to apologize and cower under the immense weight of his disappointment. For 18 years, his anger was the ultimate governing force in my life. It was the weather system we all had to survive. I do not step back. I keep my boots firmly planted on the wood my grandfather milled with his own hands. Before my father can unleash another wave of verbal fury, Valerie steps forward. She does not offer him comfort. She does not try to diffuse the situation. Instead, she pivots to her ultimate defense mechanism. She begins to weep. It is not a genuine expression of sorrow. It is tactical, calculated sobbing. I have watched her deploy these exact tears 100 times before. I watched her use them to manipulate bank tellers into extending overdraft limits. I watched her use them to secure charity board positions she did not earn. She knows exactly how to force moisture into her eyes and make her lower lip tremble, painting herself as the tragic victim of circumstances she directly created. "Sonia, how could you do this to us?" Valerie cries, clutching the lapels of her camel trench coat. Her voice adopts a practiced, heartbreaking quiver. "We owed money. The business was failing. We were drowning in obligations, trying to keep a roof over your head. How could you be so incredibly selfish?" The sheer audacity of her statement hangs in the freezing morning air. She invokes the concept of selfishness while standing on the very estate she planned to secretly liquidate while I blew out birthday candles. She attempts to weaponize guilt, assuming my conscience is as malleable as it was when I was a child. She wants me to feel responsible for the crushing debt they accumulated buying imported cars, designer wardrobes, and country club memberships they could never genuinely afford. A sharp clatter breaks through Valerie's performance. Harper drops her expensive smartphone. It hits the wooden porch, the glass screen cracking upon impact. She does not even bend down to retrieve it. My younger sister stares at me, her eyes wide, with a profound, consuming horror. She is not mourning the fracture of our family trust. She is running a frantic mental calculation of her own evaporating lifestyle. She was raised in a frictionless bubble, handed platinum credit cards, and the absolute certainty that she would never have to lift a finger to survive. "What about my new SUV?" Harper shrieks, her voice piercing and hysterical. "The dealership is waiting for the wire transfer. You just canceled my money. You stole my car!" I look at the three of them standing there. A father ready to tear me apart to save his own pride. A mother manufacturing tears to excuse her financial crimes. A sister treating the loss of a priceless family legacy like a delayed shipping order. The absurdity of Harper's entitlement provides the final heavy anchor I need. The last lingering shreds of familial obligation dissolve. I do not feel fear, and I do not feel guilt. I feel an icy, crystal-clear resolve. I didn't steal anything, I say. My voice is low and measured. It matches the steady, unyielding rhythm of the deep water docks below. I do not shout to match their panic. I let the cold truth do the heavy lifting. I protected what was rightfully mine. I continue holding Garrett's furious gaze. "You spent 4 years lying to my face. You drained the company accounts to fund a lifestyle you did not earn. You forged a legal document and tried to sell my inheritance behind my back to cover your own failures." Garrett scoffs a desperate, ugly sound. He takes another step, towering over me, trying to use his physical presence to reclaim his lost authority. "You think you're so clever," he snarls, spittle flying from his lips. "You think waving a piece of paper makes you the boss. You are an arrogant, ignorant little girl. I will call my attorneys today. I will drag you into a courtroom and sue you for gross negligence. I will have a judge declare you legally incompetent to manage this estate. I will freeze every single asset you think you control until you are begging me for pocket change. His threat is a desperate grasp at institutional power. He still believes the world operates according to his rules. He believes a judge will look at a man in a tailored suit and a teenager in a battered canvas jacket and side with the suit. He does not realize that I spent years building an airtight legal fortress explicitly designed to withstand this exact siege. My grandparents anticipated his greed, and Nolan structured the trust to be impenetrable. I look at his red, contorted face. I look at Valerie's fake tears drying in the cold wind. I look at Harper staring blankly at her shattered phone. I am done playing defense. The caretakers have been fired. I want you off my property, I state calmly. Garrett freezes. The command catches him off guard. He opens his mouth to argue, to launch another barrage of empty legal threats. I raise my right hand and point directly down the long dirt driveway toward the iron gates. I do not raise my voice. I deliver the final word with the unquestionable authority of the sole trustee. Drive. For a breathless moment, nobody moves. The standoff stretches tight, testing the new boundaries of our reality. Then Valerie breaks. She turns and practically runs toward their remaining SUV, her high heels clicking frantically against the wood. Harper follows blindly, her shoulders shaking with genuine panic. Garrett remains locked in place, glaring at me with a hatred so pure it feels radioactive. He wants to destroy me. He wants to tear down the cedar porch with his bare hands. But he knows he has lost the morning. He turns sharply, his expensive leather shoes crunching down the stairs. He climbs into the driver's seat, slams the heavy door, and starts the engine. I stand alone on the porch, watching my family retreat. The black vehicle rolls down the driveway and disappears onto the coastal highway. The air is quiet again, but the calm is entirely deceptive. I know my father. I know he will not simply drive back to his heavily mortgaged townhouse and accept defeat. Retreating is not surrendering. He is a man obsessed with his public image, and I just handed him the greatest humiliation of his life. He threatened to declare me incompetent. He threatened to freeze my assets. As I walk back inside the empty, echoing house, a chilling realization settles over me. The corporate developer was an external enemy easily dispatched with a valid contract, but fighting your own blood is an entirely different war. They know my vulnerabilities. They know my routines, and in a small Maine coastal town where reputation is currency, they control the narrative. Tomorrow morning, the gossip will start. And if whispers fail to break my spirit, they will escalate to physical control. They will try to lock me out of the very harbor I just fought to save. You cannot keep a secret in a small Maine coastal town. Information travels faster than a winter nor'easter. By Tuesday morning, my mother had already launched her counteroffensive. Valerie was never a woman to fight with her fists or raise her voice in public. She fought with whispers, polite smiles, and carefully curated victimhood. She spent the entire morning holding court in the upscale cafes along the historic downtown promenade. I walked into the local bakery to grab a black coffee before heading down to the harbor. The brass bell above the door chimed, and the lively chatter inside died instantly. Mrs. Higgins, the owner, who used to slip me extra sugar cookies when I was 10, suddenly found the grout on the floor endlessly fascinating. She handed me my paper cup without making eye contact. The silence was suffocating. I learned later what Valerie had spun. According to her tearful narrative, I was an unstable, deeply ungrateful teenager. I had exploited a legal loophole to steal the family estate right out from under my hardworking parents. I cast them out into the cold, leaving them financially destitute out of pure spite. The societal backlash was swift and biting. The owner of the marine supply store, a man who had sold me outboard motor oil for 3 years, crossed his arms when I walked in. He refused to honor my usual commercial discount, muttering something under his breath about respecting your elders. Old family friends turned their heads when I walked down the cobblestone sidewalks. My parents were deploying their favorite psychological weapon: isolation. When I was younger, any disobedience resulted in weeks of silent treatment. They wanted me to feel the crushing weight of public shame. They expected me to break under the icy stares, dissolve the trust, and crawl back to them begging for forgiveness and societal reinstatement. They fundamentally misunderstood the landscape of my life. I did not care about the opinions of the wealthy patrons wearing tennis skirts at the country club. I cared about the men and women wearing rubber boots at the docks. Gossip is ultimately passive. It stings, but it does not change the signature on a legal deed. My father realized this faster than my mother. Garrett possessed a fragile ego that demanded immediate, tangible control. If social ostracization could not force my hand, he would escalate to physical intimidation. He needed to show the town he was still the patriarch. I was standing in the galley of a dry-docked lobster boat when my phone buzzed. It was a text from one of the senior deckhands. "Your dad is down at the main distribution warehouse causing a scene. He brought new chains." I wiped the engine grease from my hands, grabbed my keys, and dialed Nolan. The Blackwood Cove commercial docks operate as the beating heart of the local economy. The air here is thick with the smell of raw diesel fuel, rotting bait, and salt brine. Heavy wooden pallets stack 10 feet high. Cranes hum and groan under the weight of iron traps. It is a place of hard labor, far removed from the polished yacht club where my birthday charade occurred. When I pulled my truck onto the gravel lot, the tension was palpable. A crowd of harbor hands and fishermen had formed a loose semicircle around the main distribution warehouse. The corrugated metal doors were shut tight. Standing front and center was Garrett. He wore a heavy wool peacoat, trying to project the rugged authority he never actually earned. Beside him stood Silas, the veteran harbor master. Silas was a mountain of a man, with a gray beard and hands scarred from decades of pulling frozen lines. He respected my grandfather deeply, but he also respected the chain of command. Until midnight on my birthday, Garrett was his legal boss. Garrett held up a set of heavy brass padlocks. He was ordering Silas to secure the warehouse doors, locking down the distribution center and effectively shutting off the entire operational hub. He intended to physically bar me from my own business. "Put the chains on the handles." Silas Garrett commanded his voice, echoing off the metal siding. "My daughter is throwing a legal temper tantrum, and until the courts sort out her ridiculous claims, nobody enters this facility." Silas hesitated, holding a thick iron chain. He looked uncomfortable, caught between a wealthy manager and his own instincts. I stepped out of my truck, slamming the door. The loud metallic thud drew everyone's attention. Nolan parked right behind me, stepping out with a manila folder tucked under his arm. We walked shoulder to shoulder through the crowd of fishermen. The men parted for us, their faces etched with quiet curiosity. I did not look at my father. I walked directly to the harbor master. "Silas," I said, keeping my tone respectful but unwavering. "Good morning," Sonia Silas replied, his voice a deep, cautious rumble. "Your dad here says there is a dispute over the property lines. He wants the warehouse sealed." Garrett sneered, stepping closer to intimidate me with his height. "This is private commercial property. You are trespassing. Get back in your truck before I call the local sheriff and have you hauled off in front of your precious dock workers." I reached over and took the folder from Nolan. I pulled out the crisp, watermarked trust documents. I handed them directly to the harbor master, ignoring my father's bluster. "There is no dispute," I told Silas. "As of yesterday morning, the caretaker period expired. Blackwood Cove and the entire distribution fleet are now held in the Hamilton Legacy Trust. I am the sole trustee. My grandfather's original will is now fully enacted. Silas wiped his hands on his denim overalls before taking the paper. He read the top paragraph slowly. His eyes drifted down to the raised notary seal and the timestamp. He recognized Nolan standing beside me, a lawyer known throughout the harbor for never backing a losing horse. A slow, knowing grin cracked through the harbor master's thick gray beard. He looked at Garrett, then back down at the legal seals. The power dynamic shifted in a single heartbeat. Garrett sensed the change. He reached out to snatch the paper. "Give me that fabricated nonsense. Silas, put the chains on the doors right now. I sign your paychecks." Silas folded the document neatly and handed it back to me. He turned his attention to my father, his expression hardening into stone. "No, you do not, Garrett." Silas corrected his voice, dropping an octave. "You signed them on behalf of Elias. But Elias left this harbor to the girl. The paper says she is the boss." Garrett turned a dangerous shade of purple. "You are firing yourself, old man. I will strip this dock down to the pylons." I stepped between them. I looked at the heavy brass padlocks dangling from my father's hand. He thought a few pieces of metal could rewrite the law. He expected me to retreat, terrified of a public confrontation. "Silas," I said, pointing toward the heavy metal handles of the warehouse door. "My father placed an unauthorized lock on my building. Cut it off." Garrett laughed, a shrill, panicked sound. "You cannot touch that. It is my property." Silas did not hesitate. He reached into the deep pocket of his canvas tool bag and pulled out a pair of heavy-duty, red-handled bolt cutters. The fishermen standing around us fell silent, watching the climax of a decades-long family rivalry play out on the gravel. The harbor master stepped up to the corrugated doors. He clamped the steel jaws of the bolt cutters around the fixed shackle of Garrett's new padlock. With one powerful squeeze of his broad shoulders, a sharp, metallic snap echoed across the harbor. The severed lock fell into the dirt, landing near the toe of my father's expensive leather shoe. Silas grabbed the heavy warehouse doors and shoved them open. The rusted tracks screeched loudly, revealing the bustling interior of the distribution center. The smell of fresh catch and cold, salt air washed over us. "Get back to work, boys!" Silas yelled to the crowd. "We have a fleet to manage." The dock workers scattered, returning to their stations. They cast amused, lingering glances at my father, who stood frozen in the dirt. His ultimate display of physical dominance had just been dismantled with a single squeeze of a hand tool. His authority was gone. His intimidation tactics were useless. He stood, publicly humiliated, in front of the very working-class men he spent his entire life looking down upon. I picked up the broken padlock from the gravel and held it out to him. "Take your trash with you," I said. Garrett did not take the broken metal. He stared at me with eyes hollowed out by pure, unfiltered hatred. The public defeat broke something deep inside him. He turned on his heel, marching back to his vehicle without another word. Nolan stood beside me, watching the truck speed away from the docks. He adjusted his glasses, his expression grim. "You won the harbor," Sonia Nolan murmured, his eyes tracking the disappearing taillights. "But you wounded a proud man in public. He has no social leverage left. He has no physical control over the property." I tossed the broken lock into a nearby scrap bin. The heavy thud felt like a victory bell. "What is his next move?" I asked, turning to face the open warehouse. Nolan sighed, his breath pluming in the cold air. "When a predator loses its teeth, it goes for the throat. They cannot take the land. They cannot take the boats, so they will attack the only vulnerability you have left. They are going to cut off your air supply." I frowned, watching a seagull dive toward the water. "What air supply?" "Your liquid cash," Nolan replied. "The trust protects the real estate, but the probate accounts take 30 days to settle. Tomorrow morning, you are going to find out exactly how desperate your parents truly are." A cold chill crept up my spine that had nothing to do with the ocean wind. The physical locks were broken, but a new, invisible trap was already waiting to snap shut. Wednesday afternoon arrived with a heavy gray overcast that mirrored the escalating tension in town. My parents, realizing that physical intimidation at the harbor had failed spectacularly, pivoted to their next strategy. They moved away from public spectacles and entered the realm of financial warfare. I was standing in the checkout lane of the local grocery market, holding a basket of basic provisions. The store smelled faintly of bruised apples and industrial floor wax. The cashier was a woman named Linda, who had known my family for a decade. Usually, she greeted me with a warm smile and a question about the boats. Today, her eyes remained fixed firmly on the barcode scanner. Valerie's smear campaign had reached every corner of the community, turning familiar faces into silent judges. The total came to $82. I slid my debit card into the chip reader. The machine processed for a long moment before emitting a sharp, discordant beep. Declined. Linda shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "You might want to try inserting it again," she murmured, her voice tight. I pulled the plastic card out and pushed it back in. The screen flashed the same red warning. Insufficient funds. A woman standing in line behind me let out a soft, theatrical sigh of impatience. The kind of sigh designed to ensure everyone nearby heard it. I recognized her from the country club. The isolation tactics were working flawlessly in public. My parents wanted me to feel the sting of poverty in front of the very people they had poisoned against me. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not apologize or frantically check my pockets for cash I knew I did not have. I simply withdrew the card, offered Linda a polite nod, and stepped away from the register, leaving the groceries on the metal belt. The crisp coastal wind hit my face the second I walked out the sliding glass doors. I climbed into the cab of my truck, the familiar scent of old leather and cedar wood offering a brief moment of comfort. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking application. The screen loaded, displaying the balance of my joint college savings account. $0.00. This was an account I had held jointly with my father since I was 14 years old. Every dollar deposited into that fund represented a bruised knuckle of freezing morning on the docks, or a summer spent scraping barnacles off the hulls of the commercial fleet. It was the physical manifestation of my sweat. And in a single afternoon, it had been wiped clean. A text message chimed on my screen. It was from Garrett. "Actions have consequences. Welcome to the real world." I stared at the glowing letters dissecting his strategy. It was a classic siege tactic. He knew the legal parameters of the Hamilton Legacy Trust better than he let on. He understood that while the real estate and the commercial fleet were now securely under my name, the liquid cash assets tied to my grandfather's estate were currently locked in a mandatory 30-day probate hold. The courts required a standard waiting period before releasing the operational funds to a new trustee. For 1 month, I was land rich and cash poor. I owned 50 acres of pristine coastline and a fleet of deep-water vessels, but on paper, I could not afford a tank of gas. Garrett expected this sudden deprivation to break my spirit. He anticipated that the sting of an empty bank account would force me to crawl back to his doorstep, begging for a loan and offering to dissolve the trust in exchange for basic survival. He thought he had starved me out. I sat in the cold cab of my truck and let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The sound echoed off the windshield. My father believed he was playing a brilliant game of chess. He failed to realize he was sitting at the wrong board. A legal strategist does not leave their most vital supply lines undefended, and a seasoned harbor hand never goes to sea without a backup generator. During those long afternoons hidden in the harbor master's office reading through dense financial regulations, I learned that joint accounts are notoriously vulnerable during transitional legal periods. I knew my parents would drain whatever they could legally touch the moment they realized the real estate was gone. So I laid a trap. 2 days before my birthday party, I quietly visited a different bank branch 2 towns over. I opened a solo private account under my name alone. I transferred the vast majority of my hard-earned tuition money into that secure vault. But I did not empty the joint account entirely. That would have raised an automatic red flag. Instead, I left a highly specific decoy amount behind. $5,000. It was a sum precisely calculated to serve as bait. It was large enough to tempt a desperate man facing immediate crushing debt, but small enough to sacrifice as a pawn in a much larger war. I wanted to see if Garrett would cross the line from poor management into blatant, undeniable theft. He took the bait. I started the truck, threw the gear shift into drive, and pulled out of the grocery store parking lot. I did not drive home to sulk. I drove straight down the winding coastal highway toward downtown Portland, the gray sky above threatening an imminent downpour. Nolan's office was quiet when I pushed through the heavy oak door. The secretary waved me straight through to the inner sanctum. The estate attorney was sitting behind his mahogany desk, reviewing a stack of maritime contracts. The antique clock on his wall ticked with the same steady rhythmic pulse it had the night I signed the trust. I walked up to his desk and dropped a printed bank fraud alert and a screenshot of the zero balance directly onto the polished wood. They took the bait, I announced. Nolan set his reading glasses on the desk. He picked up the paper, his sharp eyes scanning the transaction history. He saw the withdrawal. He saw the exact timestamp tracing it back to Garrett's personal routing number. A slow, dangerous smile crept across the lawyer's weathered face. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Your father thinks he just taught you a lesson in economics," Nolan murmured, his voice rumbling with quiet satisfaction. "He assumes this money is untraceable because his name was on the account. He assumes the local police will dismiss it as a standard family dispute. He sent a text treating it as a disciplinary action," I added, pulling up the message on my phone and placing it next to the bank statement. Nolan nodded, tapping the screen. "He is operating under the delusion of parental authority. But you are a legal adult, and this money was withdrawn after your 18th birthday. This is no longer a father grounding his daughter. This is a corporate manager stealing from his majority shareholder." I crossed my arms, feeling the rough canvas of my grandfather's jacket against my skin. What is our next move? Nolan stood up, walking over to the large window overlooking the bustling Portland streets. If a man claiming to be a successful, affluent wealth manager is desperate enough to steal $5,000 from a teenager just to cover immediate expenses, it means his safety net is gone. It means he is drowning. And if he is drowning now, we need to look at what else he has been hiding over the past 4 years to keep his head above water. The financial squeeze they thought would break me had just backfired with devastating precision. By taking that specific sum of money, Garrett handed me the exact legal leverage I needed to rip open their entire history as caretakers. This withdrawal gives us the probable cause required to bypass the standard discovery waiting periods, Nolan explained. Turning back to face me, we can file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning. We can legally force the banks to open the closed ledgers of the Commercial Lobster Distribution Company. We can audit every single penny your parents spent during their tenure. It was time to hunt. We were no longer playing defense against unauthorized real estate sales or broken padlocks. We were going on the offensive, digging into the dark, hidden corners of my family's financial history. But to conduct a forensic audit that would hold up in a courtroom, we needed a starting point. We needed a baseline to compare against my father's fraudulent bookkeeping. As Nolan began pulling thick binders from his filing cabinet, preparing for the long night of paperwork ahead, a vivid memory flashed through my mind. I remembered a rainy afternoon years ago, sitting in the harbor office while my grandfather traced a calloused finger over a balance sheet. I remembered a secret he entrusted to me, a hidden record kept far away from the prying eyes of his greedy son. I looked down at the battered canvas coat I was wearing. My fingers traced the thick, heavy seams along the inner lining, feeling the distinct rectangular outline hidden beneath the fabric. The key to destroying my father's pristine public image was literally resting against my ribs. The heavy antique clock on the wall of the law firm ticked with a rhythmic, unyielding cadence. Outside the large pane windows, the gray afternoon sky finally broke, sending sheets of cold Maine rain lashing against the glass. Nolan sat behind his polished mahogany desk, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he drafted the emergency injunction. The $5,000 theft provided the exact legal wedge we needed to pry open the closed corporate accounts. While we waited for the initial digital records to compile from the commercial distribution servers, the silence in the room stretched thick and heavy. My eyes drifted away from the glowing computer monitor and focused on the rain tracing erratic paths down the window pane. The steady drumming sound pulled my mind backward, slipping away from the sterile law office and transporting me to a remarkably similar stormy afternoon 4 years ago. I was 14 years old. The sky over Blackwood Cove was the color of bruised iron. I sat on a rickety wooden stool inside the cramped harbormaster quarters, the air smelling intensely of wet wool burning space heaters and stale tobacco. My grandfather, Elias, sat across from me. He looked older that day, his broad shoulders slightly hunched beneath the weight of a lifetime spent fighting the Atlantic. He had a thick ledger spread wide open on his battered desk. His fingers, scarred and thick as braided rope, traced a slow path down a column of handwritten figures. He tapped a specific cell, looking up at me from beneath his bushy gray eyebrows. "The water lies, Sonia," he murmured, his voice possessing the deep, resonant grit of ocean surf dragging across crushed stones. "You look out at the harbor and you see calm tides. You see the fleet sitting pretty at their moorings. It looks peaceful, but underneath the surface there are rip currents ready to drag you down to the bottom. The water will always lie to you, but the numbers never do." He turned the page, the heavy parchment crinkling under his touch. "Math does not care about your ego," Elias continued, his gaze drifting toward the window, looking out toward the main house where my father was likely pouring a midday drink. "Math does not care about what kind of suit you wear or what country club you belong to. A balance sheet is the only honest mirror in the world. It shows exactly who a man truly is, regardless of the face he paints for the town." Before I left the office that afternoon, he took his heavy canvas coat off the iron hook by the door and draped it over my small shoulders. It swallowed me whole, the hem dragging against the floorboards. "Keep it close, kid," he whispered, patting the sturdy fabric. "There is more protection in this old rag than you might think." The memory faded, dissolving back into the quiet hum of Nolan's office. I looked down at my lap. I was still wearing that exact same coat. The frayed sleeves were stained with engine grease, the brass buttons tarnished by years of salt spray. My parents had mocked this jacket endlessly, calling it a filthy eyesore, demanding I throw it into the incinerator. They never understood why I refused to take it off. I reached my hand inside the deep left pocket. My fingers traced the coarse internal seams. For years, I assumed the peculiar stiffness near the rib cage was just a patch of reinforced canvas designed to block the wind. But my grandfather was a man who built empires with his bare hands. He did not waste materials, and he did not speak in riddles. I reached across Nolan's desk and picked up a silver brass letter opener. The attorney paused his typing, looking up over the rim of his reading glasses. His brow furrowed in quiet confusion as I turned the heavy coat inside out and laid it flat across his pristine blotter. I gripped the letter opener, positioned the sharp tip against the thick inner lining, and pressed down. The fabric resisted for a brief second before giving way with a sharp tearing sound. I sliced a 6-inch vertical opening through the heavy canvas. I pushed my hand into the dark cavity between the layers of fabric. My fingertips brushed against something smooth, rigid, and distinctly rectangular. I gripped the object and pulled it free from its hidden vault. It was a small, leather-bound notebook. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling, the edges frayed and soft. I flipped the book open. The pages were densely packed with Elias's unmistakable sharp handwriting. Rows upon rows of detailed financial records, precise profit margins, operational costs, and fleet maintenance schedules dating back nearly a decade. It was a secondary ledger. My grandfather knew his son was a thief long before his heart gave out during that winter storm. Elias understood that Garrett would eventually try to manipulate the official corporate books the moment he gained access to the distribution company. To protect his legacy, the old man created an immaculate, untampered baseline of truth, and he sewed it directly into the armor he gave me to wear. I placed the worn leather book squarely in the center of Nolan's desk. The lawyer stared at the handwritten pages. He slowly took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. A low, breathless chuckle escaped his throat. "Elias, you brilliant, paranoid genius," Nolan whispered, reverence lacing his tone. The computer on the desk chimed. The emergency injunction had worked, and the bank servers had just delivered the preliminary financial records spanning Garrett's 4-year tenure as caretaker. We had the official corporate filings, and now, thanks to the hidden notebook, we had the uncorrupted baseline. We spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing the figures. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the city into darkness, but the glow of the monitor illuminated a story of staggering, unapologetic greed. My father was not a criminal mastermind. He was an arrogant amateur, leaving a trail of blatant financial breadcrumbs. "Look at this routing number," Nolan instructed, pointing a pen at a recurring monthly wire transfer listed under the company's operational expenses. Garrett categorized this as a consulting fee. $20,000 a month paid out to a firm called Horizon Management. I pulled up the state registry database on my phone and typed in the corporate entity. Horizon Management was registered to a post office box in Portland. The sole listed proprietor was Valerie Hamilton. My mother was siphoning $250,000 a year from the commercial docks under the guise of consulting fees for a shell company that produced nothing. She used fleet revenue to fund her designer trench coats and country club luncheons. The discoveries piled up faster than we could document them. We found a category labeled as aggressive marketing expansion. The outgoing wires matched the exact tuition costs for Harper's elite private academy down to the final cent. They were expensing my sister's education as a corporate write-off. We found inflated invoices for vessel maintenance, where the surplus funds were being directly routed to pay the property taxes on their personal Boston townhouse. They treated my inheritance like an endless personal treasury. They drained the lifeblood of the commercial harbor to maintain a glittering illusion of high society wealth. But as we dug deeper into the final year of records, the pattern suddenly shifted. The petty thefts, the tuition payments, the consulting fees. Those were infuriating, but they were manageable. They represented the predictable actions of greedy, status-obsessed people. But on page 42 of the bank manifest, the numbers took a dark, terrifying turn. Nolan stopped talking. The rhythmic tapping of his pen against the desk ceased. He leaned closer to the screen, his posture stiffening. "Sonia," he said, his voice dropping to a grave, serious whisper. "Look at the cash flow statement starting 8 months ago." I leaned over his shoulder. According to Elias's hidden ledger, the Blackwood Cove fleet generated a steady, reliable profit margin, even during the harsh winter seasons. But on the screen, The official accounts showed a sudden catastrophic hemorrhage of capital. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were vanishing from the primary accounts. These were not small wire transfers to fake consulting firms or private schools. These were vast, erratic withdrawals of liquid cash. Entire reserve funds dedicated to emergency vessel repairs had been liquidated overnight. This is a gaping, bleeding hole in the company infrastructure, Nolan stated, tracing the negative red figures down the screen. Garrett was not just stealing to buy luxury cars anymore. This kind of capital flight indicates blind panic. He liquidated the fleet's safety net. I stared at the negative sums, feeling a cold knot twist tight in my stomach. The missing money did not align with a new real estate purchase or a bad stock investment. Banks leave paper trails. Mortgages have traceable deeds. But this cash was simply disappearing into thin air. Why did he need to sell the estate so fast this morning? I asked, piecing the timeline together in my head. He tried to force Preston to close the deal at 8 o'clock sharp. If he was just trying to cover his lifestyle inflation, he could have negotiated for months. He could have played the market. But he needed that developer's money today, immediately. Nolan turned his chair to face me, the reflection of the monitor glowing in his eyes. Because he is not paying off a bank, the attorney replied grimly. Banks send letters. Banks negotiate terms. The only entity that demands an immediate, untraceable cash buyout under the threat of total destruction is someone operating entirely outside the law. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The stolen $5,000 from my tuition account was not a lesson in discipline. It was a panicked, desperate payment to buy a few more hours of breathing room. My father had leveraged the commercial fleet's equipment to borrow illicit cash. He was bleeding the harbor dry to pay off a violent local collector. And by stopping the real estate sale this morning, I had just inadvertently severed Garrett's only lifeline to survival. The corporate developer was the least of our problems. The monsters standing on my porch were terrified because a much larger predator was already knocking on their front door. The glow of the computer monitor cast long, distorted shadows across Nolan's mahogany desk. The rain continued to batter the window panes, mirroring the sudden storm brewing inside the sterile law office. I stared at the columns of negative red numbers bleeding across the screen, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the financial ruin my father had orchestrated. These were not standard corporate losses. A bad quarter in the commercial fishing industry looks like delayed equipment upgrades or frozen hiring budgets. What we were looking at was a frantic, terrifying hemorrhage of capital. The accounts were being drained in erratic, desperate bursts. Nolan leaned forward, his weathered face bathed in the pale light of the screen. His fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up public registry databases and cross-referencing the destination routing numbers attached to the missing funds. He traced the outgoing wires through a labyrinth of obscure holdings, finally landing on a seemingly innocuous limited liability corporation registered to a rusted mailbox in a neighboring industrial town. The attorney let out a slow, ragged breath. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Your father did not lose this money in the stock market," Sonia Nolan said, his voice dropping to a grave whisper. "He is not paying off a legitimate bank. Banks operate within the boundaries of the law. They send formal notices. They negotiate restructuring plans. This specific shell company belongs to a local syndicate known for offering unregulated, high-interest loans to desperate businessmen. Your father is bleeding the harbor dry to pay off a loan shark." The words hung in the cold air, chilling the blood in my veins. The puzzle pieces scattered across the desk suddenly snapped together with terrifying clarity, forming a picture far darker than simple embezzlement. Garrett was a man consumed by his own fragile ego. He spent his entire adult life desperately trying to impress the wealthy elite at the Portland Country Club. He wanted to be seen as a self-made tycoon, not a caretaker managing his father's fishing boats. Over the past 4 years, he took the modest stipend provided by the trust and funneled it into terrible, high-risk private investments. He threw capital at failing ventures, attempting to secure his status as a brilliant venture capitalist. When those investments inevitably tanked, his pristine public image was threatened. Instead of accepting defeat and downgrading his lavish lifestyle, he chose to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth at any cost. When legitimate credit dried up, he sought alternative lenders operating in the shadows of the coastal economy. He borrowed dirty money to keep buying tailored suits, imported vehicles, and expensive jewelry for my mother. But unregulated lenders do not hand over hundreds of thousands of dollars based on a firm handshake and a fake smile. They require collateral. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the ledger for the specific assets Garrett had leveraged to secure the illicit loans. Since he did not legally own the 50 acres of Blackwood Cove, he could not put a lien on the real estate. He used the fleet, I realized, my voice barely above a whisper. Nolan nodded grimly. He tapped a specific column on the digital spreadsheet. He used his authority as the temporary caretaker to pledge the commercial equipment as collateral. The heavy hydraulic winches, the navigation arrays, the marine diesel engines, and the actual lobster boats. If he defaults on this dirty debt, the collectors are not going to ask for a polite meeting. They are going to drive down to your harbor in the middle of the night and strip the vessels down to the fiberglass hulls. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The stakes had just escalated from a personal family dispute to a crisis threatening the livelihood of every single fisherman working on those docks. Garrett had gambled with the survival of the entire local economy just to keep his country club membership active. The timeline of the past 48 hours suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. I looked at the clock on the wall, visualizing the events of Monday morning. My parents brought the corporate developer to my porch at exactly 8 in the morning. They were frantic, demanding I stay out of sight while they signed the forged contracts. A standard bank wire transfer from a commercial real estate buyout takes roughly 3 to 4 hours to clear the institutional hurdles and register in the receiving account. The loan shark deadline was noon. I said the truth, tasting like ash in my mouth. Nolan leaned back in his leather chair, a dark expression settling over his features. Your father orchestrated a high wire act. He planned to sell your inheritance at 8, collect the developer's money by 11, and pay off the collector by noon. He was racing the clock to save his own skin. By refusing to back down on that cedar porch, I had not just inconvenienced my parents. I had not just ruined a lucrative business deal. I had unknowingly thrown my father directly into the raging fire he built with his own 2 hands. When Preston stormed off the property, he took Garrett's only lifeline with him. The noon deadline came and went. My father was left standing in the dirt with a forged document and a furious, violent creditor waiting for a wire transfer that would never arrive. Every piece of their fake, glittering life was now hanging by a single frayed thread. The financial squeeze they attempted on Wednesday afternoon was not a calculated display of parental authority. It was a symptom of blind, unadulterated panic. The $5,000 they drained from my tuition savings account was a desperate stalling tactic. Garrett stole his daughter's hard-earned summer wages to buy a few extra days of breathing room. He tossed my future into the furnace just to keep the collectors away from his front door. I stood up from the desk, pacing the length of the quiet office. The canvas fabric of my grandfather's jacket brushed against my legs. I felt a strange, cold detachment settling over my racing heart. For 18 years, my parents made me feel small. They conditioned me to believe I was a burden, a disappointment, a naive teenager incapable of understanding the complexities of the real world. They demanded obedience and punished my independence with cruel isolation. But the truth was sitting right here on a glowing computer screen. The man who ordered me around like a servant was nothing more than a frightened amateur drowning in his own arrogance. He built an elaborate cage of lies, and I had just locked the door from the outside. Print everything I told Nolan, staring out the window into the dark, rain-swept city. I want hard copies of the hidden ledger. I want the shell company routing numbers. I want the fraudulent maintenance invoices. Nolan began hitting the print commands. The heavy office printer hummed to life, churning out page after page of undeniable evidence. "We are building a war chest," Sonia, he warned, stacking the warm papers into thick manila folders. "But you need to understand the danger here. A man cornered by the law is unpredictable. A man cornered by the underworld is incredibly dangerous. The grace period he bought with your $5,000 is not going to last forever. The consequences are going to start crashing down on him very soon." I gathered the thick folders, tucking them safely inside my coat. "I know," I replied. "Let it crash." I left the law office and walked out into the freezing storm. The rain soaked my hair and plastered my clothes to my skin, but I hardly felt the cold. I climbed into my truck, turned the ignition, and pointed the headlights north, toward the coastal highway. The drive back to Blackwood Cove was treacherous. The coastal roads were slick, the wind howling through the dense pine forests lining the asphalt. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind calculating the next move in this deadly game of chess. I needed to secure the harbor docks. I needed to alert Silas to keep a watch for unauthorized vehicles attempting to access the fleet. As my truck crested the final hill leading down to the estate, the glowing headlights swept across the towering iron gates marking the entrance to my property. The gates were locked, but I was not alone in the dark. A vehicle was parked awkwardly on the gravel shoulder just outside the entrance. It was not a menacing black SUV belonging to a debt collector. It was a standard, bright yellow rideshare sedan. As my truck illuminated the scene, the back door of the sedan pushed open against the heavy wind. A figure stepped out into the freezing downpour. It was my younger sister, Harper. She was drenched, shivering violently in a thin designer jacket offering zero protection against the harsh Maine weather. She stood in the beam of my headlights, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, her face streaked with a mixture of running mascara and genuine terror. The consequences Nolan warned me about had not waited for the morning sun. The collapse of my parents' fraudulent empire was happening right now, and the first piece of collateral damage had just washed up on my doorstep. The blinding headlights of my truck cut through the freezing downpour, illuminating the pathetic figure huddled outside my iron gates. The yellow rideshare sedan did not wait around. Its taillights vanished down the coastal highway, leaving my younger sister stranded in the mud. The storm that had been punishing the Maine coastline since Wednesday had finally reached its peak on this miserable Friday night. The wind howled through the dense pine branches, driving the rain sideways. Harper stood trembling in the harsh glare of my high beams. She wore a thin silk jacket and expensive leather boots never designed to touch untreated dirt. Her pristine blonde hair hung in wet, tangled clumps across her face. Mascara ran down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She looked nothing like the radiant, arrogant girl who twirled in a designer dress at my birthday party less than a week ago. I shifted the truck into park and stepped out into the tempest. I did not rush toward her with open arms. I walked slowly, the heavy canvas of my grandfather's coat shielding me from the worst of the biting cold. I unlatched the heavy iron gate and pushed it open. Harper did not utter a word of gratitude. She did not ask for shelter. The second the gate swung wide enough, she marched right past me, her boots splashing loudly in the puddles. She stomped up the long gravel driveway toward the wraparound cedar porch, seeking refuge under the wooden overhang. I locked the gate behind her and followed. When I reached the porch, Harper was pacing frantically. The ambient glow from the porch lights cast harsh shadows across her pale, terrified face. Her teeth chattered, but the fear in her eyes was rapidly being eclipsed by a familiar, blinding entitlement. She possessed zero loyalty when she was not being actively rewarded with luxury and comfort. The moment the golden bubble popped, her true nature spilled out. "This is your fault!" Harper screamed over the sound of the crashing surf. Her voice was shrill and raw. "You did this to us! You ruined everything!" I stood at the top of the stairs, keeping a deliberate distance between us. I did not invite her inside the warm house. I crossed my arms and waited for the rest of the tantrum to unfold. "They took my car!" she sobbed, stomping her wet boot against the wooden planks. "The repo men showed up at my high school today, right in the middle of 5th period. They hooked my SUV to a tow truck while all my friends watched. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? I had to call a cheap rideshare just to get out of the city. My credit cards declined when I tried to book a hotel. Every single account is frozen." She pointed a trembling finger at me, projecting all her rage onto the only target available. "Mom and Dad are fighting nonstop." Harper continued, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "The townhouse is a nightmare. Dad is drinking straight from the bottle and breaking furniture. Mom is packing suitcases and screaming that she is filing for divorce. The bank served a foreclosure notice yesterday. And then, someone threw a brick through our front window." The mention of the brick confirmed the terrifying reality Nolan and I had uncovered in the financial ledgers. The unregulated lenders were losing their patience. The loan shark was no longer sending polite warnings. The collectors were making physical visits to the property. Garrett's fragile empire was collapsing around him, and he was dragging his favorite daughter down into the wreckage. I felt a brief flicker of pity for the 16-year-old girl standing on my porch. She was raised to be a shallow ornament, entirely dependent on stolen wealth. She lacked the survival skills required to navigate a crisis. But that pity evaporated the moment she opened her mouth again. "You have to fix this, Sonia," she demanded, wiping the dark makeup from her eyes. "You have to sign the estate over to Dad right now. He said you were holding the money hostage just to be cruel." I stared at her, my expression hardening into stone. "I am not holding anything hostage. Your father stole hundreds of thousands of dollars. He forged documents. He lied to everyone. He brought this disaster down on his own head." Harper let out a frustrated, guttural scream. "You do not understand anything. You are just a stupid harbor rat who cares more about those rusty fishing boats than your own family. You are going to get Dad sent to prison." She stepped closer, leaning into my personal space, her voice dripping with pure venom. "Dad said if you had not stopped the sale on Monday morning, everything would be fine," she spat. "He said the corporate developer was going to wire enough cash to fix the entire mess. He was going to pay back the loan sharks, he was going to fix the mortgages, and he was going to pay back the dock workers' pension fund before the state board found out it was missing." The freezing wind suddenly felt insignificant. The sound of the ocean faded into a dull roar. The blood drained entirely from my face, pooling cold and heavy in my chest. I froze. I did not breathe. I did not blink. I stared at my younger sister, analyzing the horrific words that had just tumbled out of her mouth. The pension fund. Nolan and I had scoured the corporate accounts. We found the embezzlement. We tracked the illicit loan payments. We saw the bleeding hole in the operational reserves. But my father had utilized a separate, highly regulated financial institution to hold the retirement savings of the commercial fleet. We had not subpoenaed those specific trust accounts yet, because we never imagined he would sink that low. Garrett had not just stolen from the daily operating budget. He had not just pledged the physical boats as collateral to a criminal syndicate. He had stolen the life savings of the men who worked those docks. He robbed Silas. He robbed the veteran captains who spent 40 years destroying their bodies on the freezing Atlantic to provide for their families. He took the retirement money of hard-working fishermen to pay off his illicit gambling debts and fund Valerie's country club luncheons. The stakes had just shifted with terrifying velocity. This was no longer a personal feud between an estranged daughter and her greedy parents. This was not just about saving my inheritance or keeping the estate out of the hands of a corporate developer. This was about the survival of an entire coastal community. The livelihoods of dozens of families were hanging in the balance, tethered to my father's catastrophic failures. Harper saw the profound shift in my demeanor. She mistook my stunned silence for submission. She thought her harsh words had finally pierced my armor. She thought I was ready to surrender. "So you will sign the papers?" Harper asked, her tone softening into a manipulative, hopeful whine. "You will give the harbor back so we can fix this." I looked at the girl standing in front of me. She did not care about the fishermen. She did not care about the stolen pensions. She only cared about getting her luxury vehicle back and returning to her frictionless life in Boston. "Thank you, Harper," I said softly. She blinked in confusion. "What?" I turned my back on her, walked to the heavy oak front door of the main house, and gripped the brass handle. "Thank you for handing me the final piece of the puzzle," I said, not looking over my shoulder. "There is a sleeping bag and a space heater in the detached garage. You can stay there tonight. Do not knock on this door again." I stepped inside the dark hallway and pushed the heavy door shut. The lock clicked into place with a definitive, satisfying thud, sealing her outside in the storm. I did not take off my wet boots. I did not take off my grandfather's canvas coat. I stood in the foyer, my heart hammering a relentless rhythm against my ribs, and pulled my phone from my pocket. My fingers were numb from the cold, but I dialed the number from memory. The line rang twice before the attorney answered. The sound of rustling paper echoed in the background. Sonia Nolan answered, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Tell me you are safely locked inside the house." "I am," I replied, my voice hard and sharp as cut glass. "But we need to file a new round of subpoenas the second the courthouse opens on Monday morning." Nolan paused. I could hear the immediate shift in his attention. Did Garrett make a move? "Harper just showed up at my gate," I explained, staring at the shadows stretching across the hardwood floor. "She is panicking. She let something slip." Garrett did not just empty the operational reserves to pay the loan shark. He raided the dock workers' pension fund. A long, heavy silence stretched across the cellular connection. When Nolan finally spoke, the fatigue was entirely gone from his voice, replaced by the lethal, calculating tone of a predator smelling blood in the water. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I am certain," I confirmed. He was using the real estate buyout to replace the stolen retirement money before the state regulatory board initiated their annual audit. That is why he was so desperate to close the deal before noon. I heard a heavy book slam shut on the other end of the line. "I will draft the legal filings tonight," Nolan said, the gravel in his voice scraping like a sharpened blade. If he touched the federally protected pensions, he crossed a line that ends in a federal penitentiary. I ended the call and lowered the phone to my side. The house was quiet, insulated from the raging storm outside. But the real storm was just gathering momentum. My father thought he could sacrifice the entire town to save his own pride. He was about to learn that the people of Maine do not forgive thieves, and they certainly do not let them walk away unpunished. The fierce coastal storm raged through the entire weekend, matching the turbulence brewing within my fractured family. By Monday morning, the heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a bitter, biting chill that seeped into your bones. The dawn sky was a bruised, pale gray. As I stood in the kitchen of the main house brewing black coffee, my phone buzzed against the granite countertop. It was a text message from Valerie. "Sonia, please," the message read. "We need to meet, just to talk, as family. The Rusty Anchor Diner, 7 o'clock. I agreed. The choice of venue was incredibly telling. The Rusty Anchor sat on the far edge of the county line, a dilapidated roadside diner frequented primarily by long-haul truckers and exhausted waitresses finishing their graveyard shifts. It was a place where nobody from the Portland Country Club would ever be caught dead. Valerie chose this specific location to avoid the judgmental stares of her wealthy peers. She sensed the walls closing in rapidly, and she needed neutral, invisible ground to launch her final, desperate pivot. I pulled on my grandfather's canvas coat, grabbed my keys, and drove out to the county limits. The diner smelled of burnt bacon, stale coffee grounds, and cheap floor disinfectant. The fluorescent overhead lights hummed with a low, irritating buzz. I spotted my mother sitting alone in a cracked red vinyl booth tucked in the darkest back corner. I walked over and slid into the seat across from her. I brought nothing with me except my mobile phone. I placed the device face down on the sticky Formica tabletop, pressing a button on the side to ensure the voice memo recording application was running silently. Valerie looked genuinely exhausted. The flawless porcelain makeup she usually wore as a daily uniform was entirely stripped away, revealing a woman who had aged a decade in a matter of days. Deep, bruised shadows hung beneath her eyes. Her signature camel trench coat looked crumpled and unwashed, smelling faintly of cheap motel soap instead of her usual imported French perfume. My mother always treated her physical appearance as a highly calculated strategy. Growing up, I watched her spend hours engineering her reflection, believing that a flawless exterior projected an untouchable life. Seeing her bare face, stripped of its armor, revealed the profound depth of their current desperation. She ordered no food. She simply folded her trembling hands together on the table, her knuckles white. "Sonia, we have made mistakes," she began. She adopted her softest, most maternal tone. It was a specific frequency she rarely used during my childhood, reserved strictly for moments when she needed to extract a favor or manipulate a situation. "The stress of managing your grandfather's estate was immense," Valerie continued, her voice wavering perfectly. "Your father was under unimaginable pressure to keep the commercial fleet operational during these difficult economic seasons. The burden made him make some creative accounting choices." Creative accounting choices. The phrasing was incredibly deliberate, designed to sanitize a string of federal felonies. She unclasped her leather purse and withdrew a crisp, stapled document. Her hands shook as she slid the thick paper across the greasy table. I glanced down at the bold black text printed across the top. It read, "Family Reconciliation and Mutual Release Agreement." I had spent enough hours reading dense probate law in the harbor master office to recognize a retroactive liability waiver disguised as an olive branch. I scanned the first paragraph, noting the familiar legal jargon. It contained broad indemnification clauses and hold harmless provisions. If I signed my name on that dotted line, I legally absolved Garrett and Valerie of any financial mismanagement, fraud, or outright theft committed during their 4-year tenure as my caretakers. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card wrapped tightly in a mother's fabricated apology. "Sign this, and we will give back your savings," Valerie promised, offering a weak, trembling smile. "We will return the $5,000 we borrowed from your tuition account. We can put all this ugly business behind us and be a real family again." She actually believed her meager bribe constituted a generous concession. She thought she was offering me a lifeline, assuming my anger was centered entirely around my missing college fund. I looked down at the printed paper, tracing the sharp edge of the document with my thumb. Then I looked up at the woman sitting across from me. This was the exact same person who stood on my cedar porch 1 week ago, flashing a brilliant, victorious smile, while handing my entire future over to a corporate developer. She was willing to pave over my grandfather's legacy to save her own skin. And now she expected me to sign away my legal recourse for a fraction of what she stole. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her emotional performance. I let the cold, unvarnished truth do the heavy lifting. You did not make creative choices, Mom, I said quietly, keeping my gaze locked firmly onto hers. You stole from the dock workers' pension funds to pay a loan shark. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The remaining color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent gray. Her mouth fell open, but no sound emerged. Her breath hitched in her throat. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing the full extent of my knowledge. She realized I knew about the illicit debts, the vanishing capital, and the unforgivable betrayal of the harbor crews. She could spin a story about a misunderstood teenager stealing an estate, but she could never spin her way out of stealing retirement money from the men who bled for our family. I pressed my index finger against the corner of her fraudulent legal document. I slid it back across the table until it bumped against her trembling hands. I am not your safety net, I told her. I picked up my phone, stopping the audio recording, and slipped the device securely into my coat pocket. I stood up from the booth, leaving her sitting alone in the dingy, humming diner. She thought she could manipulate me into granting them amnesty over a cup of cheap coffee. Instead, she had just provided a recorded verbal confirmation of their financial crimes to supplement the paperwork Nolan and I had gathered. The private family dispute was officially over. I had the documents. I had the confession. The truth was too large to contain within the walls of a law office or a roadside restaurant. It was time to call the fishermen together, convene a formal meeting at the distribution warehouse, and drag my parents' betrayal into the blinding light of day. I did not wait for my parents to formulate another desperate counterattack. The encounter at the roadside diner proved they would never surrender gracefully. They would continue clawing at the edges of my grandfather's legacy until nothing remained but splinters. Nolan and I moved swiftly. Utilizing my established legal authority as the sole trustee and the majority shareholder of the commercial distribution company, we convened an emergency corporate board assembly. We bypassed the sterile boardrooms located in the downtown financial district. Those polished oak tables and ergonomic leather chairs belonged to my father's world of carefully constructed illusions. We chose the main marina warehouse instead. It served as the beating heart of the local coastal economy. The sprawling structure possessed soaring corrugated steel ceilings and smelled of diesel fuel, cold brine, and wet hemp rope. The air inside the facility carried a sharp chill biting through the layers of my clothing. The cavernous space usually echoed with the sounds of heavy machinery shouting dock hands and the relentless clatter of sorting conveyors. Today, an eerie silence settled over the cracked concrete floor. We arranged 50 metal folding chairs in a wide semicircle facing a makeshift projection screen hung against a stack of wooden shipping pallets. This was not a standard boardroom. There were no imported crystal water pitchers or catered luncheons. This was the raw, unpolished core of Blackwood Cove. This was where the real work happened. Nolan stood near the entrance holding a thick stack of printed financial ledgers tucked under his arm. His expression remained grim and highly focused. He understood the volatility of the coming hour. We had sent mandatory summons to the entire operational backbone of the commercial fleet. Word traveled rapidly along the docks. By noon, the metal chairs began filling up. The men and women who arrived wore heavy rubber boots, thick wool sweaters, and faces weathered by years of punishing Atlantic winds. These were the fleet captains, the senior riggers, the shift supervisors, and the accountants who managed the daily catch. Silas, the veteran harbor master, took a seat in the front row. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, his jaw set in a hard line. He remembered the broken brass padlock from the previous week. The tension among the assembled crew was palpable, forming a quiet hum of suspicion and uncertainty. My parents arrived precisely 15 minutes late. They intended to make a grand entrance, clinging desperately to the theatrical delay tactics that once governed their social lives. The heavy metal side door creaked open, admitting a harsh gust of cold wind. Garrett walked in first. He wore a sharp navy suit, his hair meticulously styled, projecting an aura of undisturbed authority. Valerie followed close behind, her chin raised high pointedly, ignoring the scent of raw fish and engine oil permeating the air. They did not come alone. Flanking them was a man carrying a scuffed leather briefcase, wearing an ill-fitting gray suit. He was a discount attorney, likely hired on a meager retainer because Preston and the high-end corporate lawyers had abandoned them. Garrett surveyed the warehouse with thinly veiled disgust. He looked at the fishermen sitting in the folding chairs, his lip curling ever so slightly. He never respected these people. He viewed them merely as disposable gears in a machine designed to fund his lavish lifestyle. He assumed they were simple, uneducated laborers who would instinctively defer to the wealthiest man in the room. He smoothed his silk tie and marched straight to the front of the assembly, bypassing Nolan entirely. He did not wait for an introduction. He reached out and grabbed the microphone resting on a small metal podium. The feedback from the sound system shrieked briefly, causing a few captains to wince. Garrett smiled, offering a hollow, practiced expression that failed to reach his eyes. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward to address the crowd. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice projecting a smooth, artificial warmth. "I apologize for the dramatic setting today. I know rumors have been circulating around the harbor regarding the management of this company. I want to personally assure you that our finances are simply undergoing a routine corporate restructuring. We are streamlining operations and reallocating liquid assets to ensure a profitable future for everyone involved." He used corporate jargon designed to confuse the workers, hoping words like restructuring and liquid assets would mask the reality of his theft. He paused, letting his hollow promises sink in, before turning his gaze toward me. He adopted a look of profound paternal sadness. "My daughter, Sonia, recently turned 18, he continued, his tone dripping with patronizing condescension. "She is young. She is still grieving the loss of her grandfather, and she is terribly confused about the complex protocols required to run a multi-million-dollar enterprise. She has misinterpreted standard accounting practices as something nefarious. We are here today to clear the air, correct her misunderstandings, and restore order to the harbor." Garrett expected me to shrink under the weight of his public dismissal. He anticipated that the rugged, seasoned fisherman would nod in agreement, siding with the mature businessman over a teenager wearing a stained canvas coat. He thought my youth was a fatal liability. He believed my silence during his speech indicated submission. He had no idea I was merely letting him dig his own grave in front of the very people he had betrayed. I did not argue with him from the sidelines. I did not raise my voice in protest or defend my own sanity. I felt the comforting weight of my grandfather's hidden ledger pressing against my ribs. I walked forward, my heavy boots echoing sharply against the concrete floor. The room fell dead silent. Every single eye tracked my movement. I walked past the discount lawyer who shifted uncomfortably, clutching his cheap briefcase like a shield. I stepped right up to the podium, standing mere inches from my father. I did not look at his face. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a small silver flash drive. A laptop sat on a metal folding table next to the podium, connected to the overhead projector. I plugged the drive into the port. The device chimed softly, registering the connection. I pulled up the primary folder containing the unredacted bank records, the shell company routing numbers, and the undeniable proof of the stolen pension funds. I kept my hand resting on the computer mouse, ready to unleash the devastating evidence. I finally turned to face the crowd of weathered captains and dockhands. I looked at Silas in the front row. I looked at the accountants who had blindly followed Garrett's directives for 4 years without questioning the missing capital. Then I glanced sideways at my father. His confident facade was beginning to fracture, replaced by a sudden creeping panic as he stared at the glowing white screen behind me. I stepped up to the microphone. The cold metal brushed against my lips. My voice remained steady, carrying a calm, undeniable certainty that resonated through the cavernous warehouse, reaching every corner of the room. "My father is right about one thing," I announced, letting the statement hang in the freezing air. "I am young, but I am not confused." I clicked the left button on the wireless mouse. The overhead projector whirred to life, its internal cooling fan cutting through the tense quiet of the room. A blinding beam of white light shot across the dusty air, illuminating the corrugated steel wall directly behind my father. 10-foot-tall spreadsheets materialized against the cold metal. The raw financial data of Blackwood Cove, previously locked behind closed doors and encrypted files, was now laid bare for every harbor hand, fleet captain, and accountant to witness. I held a small laser pointer in my right hand. I pressed the button, sending a bright green dot dancing across the projected numbers. I guided the laser to a specific row, highlighted in stark yellow, keeping my posture rigid and my breathing even. "Look at April 12th, I instructed. My voice echoed off the high ceilings. Perfectly steady, stripping away any trace of the confused teenager my father had just described. "Every month, a set percentage of the commercial catch revenue is legally mandated to be deposited into the Dock Workers Retirement Trust. On that Tuesday, those contributions were halted by direct executive order." I moved the green dot across the ledger, tracking the line item to the corresponding outgoing wire transfer column. That exact amount, down to the final dollar, was routed to a luxury auto dealership in Boston to purchase a vehicle for my sister, I stated. The warehouse went entirely still. You could hear the distant muffled cry of a seagull outside the metal walls. The men sitting in the folding chairs were tough, seasoned laborers. They endured freezing rain, punishing hours, and crushing waves to earn those wages. Watching their future get traded for a teenage girl's status symbol paralyzed them. The betrayal was too profound to process instantly. I did not give them time to recover from the first blow before delivering the second. I clicked the mouse again, advancing the presentation to the next slide. The green laser darted toward the bottom of the new ledger. August 3rd. I announced, raising my voice just enough to ensure the cheap lawyer standing near my parents heard every single syllable. Fleet maintenance funds the capital designated to replace fraying winch cables and patch failing hulls were liquidated. The money was diverted to an offshore holding company to service an illicit personal debt. I turned my head to look directly at my father. The smug patrician mask had melted off his face. His skin took on a sick, chalky pallor. He opened his mouth, but his throat seized, rendering him mute under the glaring projector light. He did not pledge his own assets to secure those shadowy loans. I continued, turning back to the crowd, refusing to let the tension drop. He used the commercial fleet. He put liens on the boats you take into the Atlantic every morning. He gambled your lives and your safety equipment to pay a local loan shark. The suffocating silence shattered. The room erupted into a deafening roar of booming, furious shouting. 50 seasoned fishermen shot up from their metal folding chairs simultaneously. Steel legs screeched harshly against the cracked concrete floor. The sound was overwhelming, a tidal wave of righteous anger crashing down on the front of the room. Men who had known Garrett since he was a boy, yelled curses, their faces flushed bright red with betrayal. Garrett gripped the microphone on the podium, his knuckles turning white. "She is lying," he screamed. His voice cracked, desperate to overpower the roaring crowd. "These documents are forged! It is a fabrication! She manipulated the data to steal the company from her own family!" His defense was pathetic, and the only legal professional in his corner knew it instantly. The discount attorney, hired to represent my parents, took one look at the furious mob of dock workers, glanced at the airtight financial records projected on the wall, and made a swift, professional calculation. He recognized the undeniable trail of federal felonies displayed in 10-foot font. The lawyer snapped his scuffed leather briefcase shut, turned his back on my father, and briskly walked out the side door. He abandoned his clients to the wolves without saying a single word of farewell. Valerie did not attempt to defend her husband or calm the crowd. The moment the fisherman surged forward, she shrank down into her metal chair. She crossed her arms over her head and pulled her designer coat tight around her shoulders, attempting to physically hide from the crushing weight of public exposure. The meticulously crafted reputation she spent decades building among the town elite evaporated in exactly 4 minutes. Her country club friends would hear about this before sunset. She was ruined, and her posture proved she knew it. The fishermen began advancing toward the podium, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. Silas, the veteran harbor master, stepped ahead of the pack, his fists clenched tight at his sides. Before the situation could escalate into a physical altercation, I clicked the mouse one final time. The spreadsheet vanished. In its place, a high-resolution scan of the failed real estate contract appeared on the steel wall. Preston's corporate letterhead sat at the top, and Garrett's fraudulent signature sat glaringly at the bottom. "They knew the regulatory board was coming to audit the pension funds," I shouted over the noise, forcing the crowd to halt and look at the screen. They knew the loan sharks were running out of patience. They tried to sell Blackwood Cove on my 18th birthday to a corporate developer to cover up their crimes. They tried to sell your jobs, your harbor, and your legacy to pave over this coastline. I lowered the laser pointer, letting the green dot vanish into the dark floor. "They failed," I said. The fishermen stopped their advance. They formed a tight, impenetrable barricade around the front of the room, effectively trapping my parents against the corrugated wall. The fiery rage in their eyes transitioned into a cold, hard judgment. It was the look of men who had just excised a tumor from their community. The smear campaign my mother launched in the downtown cafes was dead crushed to dust under the undeniable weight of structural truth. The town did not look at me and see an ungrateful, rebellious daughter anymore. They looked at Garrett and Valerie and saw the thieves who tried to steal their futures. The public exposure was final, stripping away every ounce of their unearned prestige. There was nowhere left for them to hide in this state. Silas stepped right up to the podium. He placed his large, scarred hand firmly on Garrett's shoulder. The grip looked unyielding. "You are done here," the harbor master growled, his deep voice vibrating with restrained fury. Nolan stepped forward from the back of the room, signaling that the legal eviction was formally commencing. I watched my parents being escorted toward the warehouse exit, surrounded by the very people they used to look down upon. They were stripped of their authority, their dignity, and their access to my grandfather's empire. I stood at the podium, breathing in the cold, diesel-scented air of my reclaimed harbor. The immediate threat was neutralized. The thieves were caught and cast out. But as the heavy metal doors slammed shut behind my parents, the hardest part of the equation remained unsolved. The illicit debts were still outstanding. The dock workers' pension vault was still empty. The loan shark was still circling the property expecting his payment. And Preston, the humiliated Boston developer, was not a man who simply walked away from a broken deal. The battle for the truth was won, But the war to save the harbor from bankruptcy was just beginning, and I was going to need an unexpected ally to rebuild the foundation. The heavy metal doors of the distribution warehouse shutting marked the definitive end of my father's reign. The immediate fallout was swift, surgical, and legally devastating. The corporate board, comprised now of loyal fleet captains and senior accountants who had just witnessed the depth of the betrayal, held an impromptu vote right there on the cold concrete floor. Garrett was formally ousted from his position as caretaker and operational manager. His name was stripped from every bank account, every vendor contract, and every property deed associated with the harbor. He was entirely locked out of the empire he had tried to dismantle. Nolan did not give my parents time to mount a defense or hire better representation. He cornered them with a stark, non-negotiable settlement. The attorney laid out the documented proof of the federal felonies, the illicit offshore wire transfers, and the forged real estate extensions. He offered Garrett a brutal choice. He could face a highly publicized trial that would inevitably end with a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary, or he could sign a binding agreement to liquidate every remaining personal asset they possessed to restore the stolen dockworker pensions. My father, terrified of spending the next decade in a prison cell, chose the latter. The liquidation process was merciless. They were forced to sell their imported luxury vehicles back to the dealerships at a steep loss. They drained their private retirement accounts, surrendering the safety net they had spent their lives building. They liquidated the expensive designer jewelry Valerie wore to her country club luncheons, handing over diamond necklaces and luxury watches to independent appraisers. Every single dollar they surrendered was carefully routed back into the secure retirement trust, making the fishermen whole again. The meager scraps left over from the fire sale were just enough to pay off the dangerous local creditors, satisfying the loan shark debt and keeping the violent collectors away from the docks. The settlement saved them from prison and physical harm, but it left them financially destitute. But the ultimate, most poetic consequence arrived from an entirely unexpected direction. Preston, the Boston developer, who stormed off my porch in a blind fury, was a man who despised being humiliated. He was an apex predator in the commercial real estate market, and Garrett had dragged his firm into a fraudulent, embarrassing mess that nearly exposed his company to a criminal investigation. Preston did not just drive back to Massachusetts and forget the insult. He directed his vast legal team to dig into my father's personal finances, searching for a critical vulnerability. They found a glaring weakness. To maintain their opulent high society lifestyle without drawing suspicion, my parents had taken out multiple secondary mortgages on their pristine Boston townhouse, leveraging the property well beyond its actual market value. Because Garrett had drained his capital to pay the loan shark, those secondary loans were currently in default. Preston recognized the opportunity for a flawless surgical strike. His development firm quietly purchased the defaulted debt from the holding banks, effectively becoming my parents' primary creditor overnight. 2 weeks after the warehouse confrontation, Preston executed his trap. He legally foreclosed on the Boston townhouse. The eviction was rapid and unforgiving. The man my parents had brought to Maine to steal my home was the exact same man who legally forced them out of theirs. They were locked out of their polished residence, their remaining designer furniture seized to cover the outstanding debt. They had gambled my inheritance to save their glittering public image, and in the end, they lost both. The harbor was secure and the thieves were banished, but the commercial fleet still needed a significant influx of capital to repair the operational deficit Garrett left behind. The fishing boats required urgent maintenance, the winches needed replacing, and the emergency reserve funds were still dangerously low. I sat in the harbor master office one afternoon, staring at the coastal tide charts and made a decision that shocked even Nolan. I picked up the phone and dialed Preston's direct line. The developer was initially silent when he heard my voice. He expected a terrified teenager, but I spoke to him as a peer. I proposed a highly structured business arrangement. On the far northern edge of Blackwood Cove sat a jagged, rocky inlet. The water there was too shallow for commercial lobster boats to navigate and too treacherous for recreational sailing. To a working fisherman, it was useless acreage. But to a developer seeking a foothold on the pristine Maine coast, it was a blank canvas. I did not offer to sell him the land. The deed would remain securely locked inside the Hamilton Legacy Trust, forever shielding it from any future corporate buyouts. Instead, I offered him an exclusive 99-year commercial lease on that specific rocky inlet to construct a high-end sustainable marine research facility. It allowed Preston to build a prestigious, eco-friendly project that would bolster his firm's public profile and satisfy his desire to develop the coastline while keeping the commercial fishing docks entirely untouched. Preston recognized the brilliance of the compromise. We negotiated the terms over 3 grueling days. The resulting contract provided an immense upfront lease payment. That single transaction fully funded the necessary mechanical upgrades for the entire fishing fleet, restored the company emergency reserve accounts to their highest levels in a decade, and guaranteed my university tuition in cash. I used the very shark my parents invited into our waters to fund my empire, transforming a dire threat into a permanent stream of revenue. A full year has passed since that freezing morning on the porch. The dense autumn fog still rolls off the Atlantic in thick gray waves blanketing the jagged coastline just as it always has. I stand on the cedar wraparound deck of Blackwood Cove, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the harbor awaken. The estate is no longer a battleground. It is an impenetrable fortress. Down below, the commercial fleet hums with renewed energy. The hulls are freshly painted, the hydraulic winches run smooth, and the dock workers move with the steady, purposeful confidence of men who know their futures are secure. Silas waves to me from the end of the main pier, his deep voice carrying over the sound of the crashing surf. I wave back, feeling the rough, familiar canvas of my grandfather's jacket against my skin. The hidden ledger is gone, locked safely away in a downtown bank vault alongside the trust documents. But the armor it provided remains a part of me. My parents now live in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of an industrial town miles away from the ocean. Their prestigious country club memberships were permanently revoked. Their wealthy friends stopped returning their phone calls the moment the rumors of the pension theft were confirmed. Harper was forced to enroll in a public high school, slowly learning what it actually means to work a part-time retail job just to pay for her own clothes. The authority and the glittering image they protected so fiercely are gone, replaced by the harsh reality of the working-class life they spent decades looking down upon. The bridge between us remains heavily guarded, and we have not spoken a single word to each other since the day the warehouse doors closed. They used to tell me I was too young to understand how the real world functioned. They assumed my quiet obedience was a symptom of ignorance. They thought my silence was submission. They never realized that while they were busy building a fragile house of cards on stolen money and forged signatures, I was methodically laying a foundation of solid Maine granite. And granite does not break when the storm comes. The Architecture of Belonging, a reflection on family truth and boundaries. We are raised on a very specific, deeply ingrained blueprint of the American family. It is a structure built on the promise of unconditional support, Sunday dinners, and the comforting assurance that no matter how harsh the world becomes, home will always remain a sanctuary. We are taught that parents are the ultimate protectors, the steady hands guiding us through the turbulent waters of youth into the shores of independent adulthood. But what happens when the architects of that sanctuary are the very ones tearing up the floorboards? What happens when the people entrusted with our emotional safety view our independence not as a triumph of their parenting, but as a direct threat to their control? The stories of Dana, Mila, Beverly, and Sonia are not just isolated dramatic events. They are profound reflections on the silent crises occurring behind closed doors in neighborhoods across the country. They force us to examine the terrifying gap between the polished image of the traditional family and the heavy, often hidden realities of emotional neglect, favoritism, and manipulation. In American culture, we frequently romanticize the concept of tough love. We applaud parents who claim they are preparing their children for the harsh realities of the real world by removing safety nets. But there is a dangerous, razor-thin line between discipline and cruelty, between teaching responsibility and demanding total submission. When a parent uses financial ruin as a teaching tool, like secretly trying to purchase a daughter's eviction or forging documents to liquidate an inheritance to cover their own fraud, they are not teaching a moral lesson. They are deploying a weapon. True family responsibility is rooted in deep, unshakable honesty. It requires parents to possess the emotional awareness to distinguish between what is genuinely best for their child and what merely serves their own fragile ego or protects their public reputation. When fear and isolation are used as leverage to force a child back into obedience, the traditional family structure ceases to be a home. It becomes a hostage situation. The greatest failure a parent can commit is confusing their child's desperate need to survive with a vindication of their own toxic methods. Then there is the quiet, devastating poison of favoritism, a subtle rot that can destroy the foundation of even the most seemingly perfect family. Emotional awareness in parenting means recognizing that children do not measure love by the size of a bank account or the logical justifications provided for a missed milestone. They measure love by presence. When parents choose a spontaneous luxury ski vacation over a medical school graduation, or skip a hard-earned housewarming because the golden child happens to be moving that same weekend, they are communicating a profound and lifelong verdict. The lesson here is that parental absence is never neutral. It is an active, aggressive choice. Children who grow up in the shadows of a favored sibling, the glass children, who learn to build their own tables in the backyard shed because they are perpetually denied a seat in the dining room, learn early on that fairness is an illusion. Raising a child with integrity means distributing your presence, your pride, and your attention equitably. It means understanding that the quiet child needs you just as much as the loud one, and that praising one sibling while actively ignoring the other does not build character. It breeds a quiet, lifelong grief. Long-term guidance for children must be anchored in radical accountability. We relentlessly tell our children to be honest, to admit when they are wrong, and to clean up their own messes. Yet so often, parents refuse to live by the same moral code. When adults embezzle from their own family businesses, drain joint college savings accounts to pay off illicit debts, or construct elaborate webs of lies to maintain a country club facade, they are teaching their children that reputation is infinitely more valuable than integrity. The traditional family structure is utterly meaningless if it is built on a foundation of deceit. True parental guidance requires the humility to look your child in the eye and say, "I was wrong." When parents refuse to apologize, when they demand grace and gratitude without offering consistent, changed behavior, they force their children to become the adults in the room. The children are left to enforce the boundaries, to call the lawyers to expose the fraud, and to bear the crushing weight of holding their own blood accountable. It is a burden no child should ever have to carry, yet it is a reality many are forced to survive. These narratives resonate so deeply with us because they strip away the polished veneer of the American dream to reveal the raw, beating heart of what it actually means to belong to a family. They remind us that healing does not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes healing means recognizing your own worth and refusing to cooperate with something that is fundamentally wrong. If you have ever sat at a family table where you felt entirely invisible, or if you have ever had to build a fortress of legal and emotional boundaries just to protect your own peace, you are not alone in that quiet rebellion. We share these experiences to remind each other that our pain is valid and that walking away from toxicity is not a failure of loyalty, but a triumph of self-preservation. If these reflections resonated with you, if you see fragments of your own journey in these moments of quiet defiance, please subscribe and follow Amanda Told Stories. Join our community. Share your own experiences in the comments below and help us continue to bring these powerful, necessary conversations out of the shadows and into the light. Ultimately, society dictates that blood is thicker than water. We are relentlessly conditioned by our culture to believe that family is an unbreakable contract, a lifelong debt we owe simply by virtue of being born. We are told to forgive, to forget, and to keep the peace at all costs, because they are your parents, or they are your family. But perhaps that conventional wisdom is the greatest lie we have ever been sold. The truth, the deeply uncomfortable, radical truth, is that loyalty should never require the erosion of your own soul. The most profound act of emotional awareness is not learning how to endlessly tolerate the people who hurt you. It is learning that love is not a biological obligation. It is a privilege that must be earned and maintained through consistent respect. Sometimes the most beautiful, healthy, and responsible thing you can do for your family is to stop trying to save them from themselves. Sometimes the ultimate victory is not forcing them to finally understand your pain, but simply looking at the empty chair they left behind, turning the lock on your own front door, and realizing that the silence they meant as a punishment is actually the exact sound of your freedom.